This is Tony Keith, the digital content manager at KKTV 11 News, and I'm joined once again by Steve Carlton. He's the chief clinical officer for Gallus Medical Detox Centers. And Steve, we've talked a while back about Tranq, a nickname for a type of fentanyl that includes xylazine. It's a tranquilizer normally used on horses, definitely not safe for people, not that any type of fentanyl is. The DEA and other law enforcement agencies across the country, they've been warning about this. But my first question for you, when it comes to treatment centers, healthcare institutions, why haven't they been testing for Tranq until now?
It's a great question, Tony. And so, what's interesting to know about drug trends in the US is, especially nowadays, there's lots of drugs that come and go really quickly. Stuff that most people have never heard about at home. With fentanyl, that's how this started, right? When fentanyl first hit the streets, nobody knew what it was. Everybody sort of assumed that it was going to come and go very quickly. And so our testing for it, which is used to help people withdraw safely, help people get treatment, sort of detect, like, what are you actually using, was very slow to catch up. It took years. And we're seeing that same trajectory with xylazine right now, but luckily we've identified a company that has created some point of care testing, so urine drug tests that will detect it and pick it up. And unless you do that, it's going to be really hard to provide adequate quality treatment across the country for this growing trend.
It makes sense to me right away. I think of, and I think a lot of people can relate to this. COVID-19 pandemic hit, and it was new. And step one was we have to test for it. We have to test for it. We're talking pandemic disease, but why
Yeah.
is Tranq so important to test for?
Yeah, that's a great parallel with COVID testing, Tony. Tranq is so important to test for because what people need to remember is fentanyl is a painkiller, classified as an opiate. Xylazine is a tranquilizer, more in the sedative category. So they're two completely different types of drugs that have different effects on the brain, and both have a high risk of overdose, addiction, and physiological dependence on them, which causes that withdrawal. And so detection allows places like Gallus Detox to figure out what type of medication do we need to be using for this person to treat and manage their symptoms. If you don't get what Gallus does a great job of keeping people really comfortable and staying really proactive about withdrawal symptoms, because the most common thing in addictions treatment, unfortunately, is when people get uncomfortable in that withdrawal and they don't feel like their needs are being adequately met, they leave treatment, right? And then obviously that increases their risk of overdose and death again. So early detection, being able to figure this out is everything in terms of helping people long term.
Understanding the addiction, that's
Yeah.
key. And that's when it comes to this test, and you found this company to work with. Walk me through it. Is it simple? How do you go about it? What does the actual testing show as far as results?
It's very simple. It's a urine drug screen. And so you take urine from someone, and you there's the test is actually a dipstick, or on the cup itself it absorbs, and the test will show typically two lines if it's positive for that substance. um, those results need to be verified by a lab, and right now a lot of point of care testing cannot be used as a diagnostic test, right? We still treat people based on their symptoms and how they're showing up, but it is a piece of the puzzle, sort of figuring out what drugs are in your system.
And it's a big puzzle to solve, and every piece
Yes.
does matter when it comes to completing that puzzle.
Mhm.
We're going back to the drug itself, Tranq, if you will. You and I have talked about this before. If somebody didn't catch that interview, what are the differences between a person with withdrawals on Tranq compared to a majority of the other fentanyl we see out on the streets?
Yeah, great question. So with fentanyl and opiates, fentanyl is like heroin, right? So if people have seen Basketball Diaries or Train Spotting or these types of movies, you sort of know that opiate withdrawals look very much like the flu, right? It looks like a really, really bad flu is the best comparison. Um, with xylazine, it's more in the sedative family. It's not in the benzodiazepine class of drugs, but you typically have more of that shakiness, that confusion. You have tremendous anxiety is the biggest one. And the one that we notice most in our detox facilities is somebody comes in thinking they're just using fentanyl, but their anxiety and that shakiness is just off the charts, and they're not responding in that typical way that somebody just withdrawing from fentanyl is showing up.
It can be really hard for family members to notice these signs because you may just have a family member who is dealing with an illness all the time. It does turn into those red flags. Keeping an eye out for those red flags and sparking a conversation. I got to say that Gallus is ahead of the curve when it comes to testing for xylazine. But I'm wondering, what about Narcan? If when you talk about those red flags, if somebody
Yeah.
ODs, when it comes to Tranq, does Narcan help?
Narcan. So in 48, we know that xylazine is showing up in 48 states in the fentanyl supply. So 20% of the fentanyl supply out there on the streets has xylazine in it. So if somebody has nodded off, they are unconscious, their breathing is shallow, people should still use Narcan. It will not hurt you. If you're overdosing from the xylazine in that pill or in that substance that you just ingested, or your loved one is, the Narcan won't bring them out of the xylazine overdose, but it will bring them out of the fentanyl overdose. And the good news is you're not going to hurt anybody. If you give somebody Narcan, it's not going to hurt them. And so you just give it. But if they're not responding to Narcan doses and administration, you have to get them to a hospital as quickly as possible.
Scary to think
There,
about. And you said 28% now. Is that right? Correct me if I'm wrong.
20% of
20.
the fentanyl supply uh, across the country is being shown to have xylazine in it.
20%. So that's something I'm going to look into after this interview because that is startling since the last time we talked. Last time we talked, it felt like it's still pretty fresh and new. Like you said, testing is important, figuring out, who's getting it and where. When it comes down to it, the hope is you don't get to that point with a loved one or yourself where you have to call 911 or rush to the hospital. How can people get help outside of waiting until it's too late?
I think with fentanyl and with xylazine, it is sort of all about how you approach your loved one, right? And I think people have to understand that people struggling with addiction, they are in survival mode. That is a really difficult thing to maintain and manage. They are just doing their best to get through the day without getting terribly sick. And so if you are worried about your loved one, I would suggest people get organized and have that and use your time wisely in terms of having that conversation with the person. Talk about sort of different treatment options, sort of explore what type of insurance benefits people have and what type of resources they have and what's accessible for them. And doing that research when you approach somebody to say, help me help you, is really important because they're going to need that support.
That is a huge message, and it is something working on the news side of things. This drug impacts people of all backgrounds, all income levels. You may not even realize it, but for more about that help, I do have to say, Steve, gallusdetox.com. I appreciate these interviews, talking with you one-on-one. We don't have a lot of these partnerships with a lot of organizations across the state, but you have provided us with great information, great insight. You can also, if you want to call 888-306-3122. Anything else you wanted to add on top of this topic, Steve?
I think the one last thing I would add when you're talking about testing for this, these xylazine tests are still not FDA approved, and most of the fentanyl point of care testing is not either. And we need to speed up that process. Like legislators need to speed up that process as quickly as possible. And to give a comparison and help sort of drive this point home, if somebody's on probation or parole and they're given one of these tests, legal systems will use that as evidence to send somebody back to jail or even prison, right? But right now, under the current legislation and laws, we can't use that as sort of a diagnostic test, and that needs to change nationwide. We need to get FDA approval, and like your COVID example, detection's everything. We've got to start better testing for this and make better efforts there.
Perfect. Thank you as always, Steve, for the time.
Yeah, thank you, Tony.
And bear with me for a second. I'm